Thanksgiving is coming up, and I've been thinking a lot about the stories that we tell about Thanksgiving and on Thanksgiving. And so I've actually been reading this book, Black Indians, A Hidden History. Just by accident, it happened to be the thing that I was reading at this time period, and I read this narrative of the first actual colony in the United States. And, when we're talking about Thanksgiving, we're talking about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. Some people will point out the fact that there was actually a colony before then, which was Roanoke, which failed, apparently, because they were incapable of seeing the Native Americans as allies in figuring out how to survive in this new land. And so we just, pretend that didn't exist, lost colony, wiped from history, no lessons learned there. But then, you have a couple decades later, the Pilgrims coming and giving thanks and only being able to survive because of the support given by the Native Americans. And it's just really weird because we kind of end the story there. It's a history. It's something that happened in the past. Oh, thank goodness they taught us about corn. And then we just kind of pretend that was in the past. There were people who lived here and now they're gone or something. And some people start to talk about the fact that, just a couple years later, we committed one of the largest genocides in history against that set of people that we're giving thanks to. And I remember being a kid and being like, oh, well, shouldn't we give thanks for the fact that we're on former Native American land? And then I realized that, we don't give thanks for something that we stole. And that we're only on this land because we committed grave violence against them. And so, I've celebrated misgivings or focused more on giving thanks to my family. But I think that there really is a value to knowing the first narrative of the first lasting colony here on our land. It's something that you wouldn't expect, and I think highlights an allyship that I actually think is really, really, really important today. Both with the fact that colonization of this land is not a distant history. It's happening to this day. I grew up in Florida and then lived in New England, and it's like, it was hundreds of years ago. It was my grandparent, 3 generations back. But, you go to the West and you realize that it was, 1920 when some of these states became part of the United States. And you think about the treaties that we signed with the Native American people, and you can see that constantly, including right now, the land is shrinking that they have. We are actively colonizing their land, and I think that the most intense example of this that I think the media, that we can no longer ignore, is Standing Rock. You have right now, this week, on Thanksgiving, literally, you have corporations, American corporations, on native land, on sacred land, attacking the people? What the hell is this, 1600? What does it mean for us to give thanks as a verb? What does it mean for us to actually support each other and live solidarity? So about a century before the Mayflower, there was San Miguel de Guadalupe. It starts on the island of Hispaniola in the 1520s. For those of you who don't know, Hispaniola is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it was one of the first colonies of the Spanish in the Americas. At the time, it was Hispaniola. And so this would again be about 100 years before the British came on the Mayflower to kind of the northeast. We have the Spanish in Haiti and the DR. And they actually had slaves there from Africa that they had already brought. So we often think about the slave trade, we think about the way that it was used in southern plantations in the United States. It's important to understand that the slave trade was already functioning in South and Central America and the Caribbean, with African slaves being brought mostly for Spanish and French colonies. And so this story starts with a wealthy Spanish official in Hispaniola named Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon. And he had heard about this land and wanted to go on a trip to create a colony in what would be contemporary United States. And so this would actually be the first documented colony created by foreigners, especially Europeans from overseas, on American land, United States land. And so what he started with was he sent a captain, Francisco Gordillo, to locate good land and make relations with the local inhabitants. And Captain Gordillo actually was supposed to bring someone to help him communicate and build better relations, but instead he brought a slave hunter, Pedro de Quejos. And the two men went to what is today South Carolina, and instead of developing positive relationships with the native inhabitants, they captured 70 Native Americans to be brought back to Hispaniola as slaves. Now, when they returned to Lucas Ayllon's, hometown in Hispaniola in Santo Domingo, he was like, "What is this? Like, in no way did I tell you to go get 70 slaves. This is absurd." And so he was very angry, and he actually sent the same two people back to the same area. They declared that these 70 people who had been captured were free and could return. And they were supposed to bring them back. Now, the records seem to show that it's unclear if they did that. What it does show is that when they came back from this trip where they were supposed to restore the relations, they actually brought more people to be enslaved, claiming that they had volunteered to give tours, which seems really unlikely, especially when you see what happened later. So that's the story kind of this guy, Quejos. He seems like quite a character. And so basically, after they send it back, they decide, okay, we're gonna set up a colony here with Spanish people, and they set up these ships to sail from Hispaniola to South Carolina with about 500 Spanish men and women and 100 enslaved Africans to build the colony. And they also bring the remaining indigenous peoples that were taken as slaves to help them kind of understand the land and translate to the local people. Now, this trip seems to have gone horribly awry. They landed on the wrong shore, and they lost one of the boats. And upon landing, it seems like pretty much immediately all of the volunteer tours disappeared into the wilderness. So these Spanish people show up and they have no idea what they're doing. They're in the wrong location. But either way, Lucas is like, we're going to do this. It's going to work. I got permission from the king. I'm not going to look like a mess. We're going to set up this town. And they go and they find the river that they think they were talking about before, which is the Pidi River. And they set up the colony, or the settlement, that they call San Miguel de Gualdape. And this would be the first foreign colony on U.S. soil, San Miguel de Gualdape in South Carolina. And once they arrive, they immediately begin to have the enslaved Africans build the houses that they're all going to live in. And so at that moment, in 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon begins black slavery in the United States. And so the Native Americans who were in the area seem to have fled farther away. I think the same people who came before, who took 70-something of their people for slaves, now are here with these dark-skinned people in chains building everything, probably very jarring, and they really, go away. And an interesting thing is that the Spanish records show that the community of Indians living there lived in these shared, huge, pine, weather-insulated homes that slept about 300 people inside. So this is something like they've never seen before. The Europeans literally cannot survive. So they're getting diseases, they're unable to produce food in the area. because they don't know how to farm the land. The river seems to have plenty of fish, but they're all too weary to be able to fish, so they can't eat the fish. And the only people who seem to be like accustomed to the tropical climate are these African slaves that are literally supporting this community of European colonists of, hundreds. And so Lucas, pretty soon after, actually becomes very ill and dies. But before he dies, he names the successor who's going to lead the colony, his nephew, who actually is in Hispaniola. And so it's a nightmare because there's no leadership in the colony, and anytime these kind of sects of people rise up to try to take over the colony, they're murdered by the others, saying that they're traitorous against the true leader. And so the enslaved Africans seem to see an opportunity here, and they start setting fires to the houses that they're building. And apparently, in November of this year, so I think they've been there about 4 months at this time, which is crazy that they've gone through all of this in 4 months. Been there for 4 months this time, and apparently the Native Americans start kind of going in and attacking the lands and freeing the African slaves. And so there's this huge slave rebellion where they burn all the houses. The Native Americans come and smuggle all of these Africans out into the Native American communities, and they live there together, apparently in peace and seeing each other as free people. And the Spanish at this point realize that they can't survive without the Africans doing everything for them. And so they get back on the boat and go back to Hispaniola, and it was seen as a failed colony. But what I want to recognize is that the Africans remained there. The Africans lived there. So we're talking about dozens that must have still been alive. I don't know how many died, but there must have been dozens of Africans now living, freely in a joint community with these Native Americans in South Carolina 100 years before the Pilgrims. And so this would be the first community that included foreigners from overseas and successfully maintained. It's just that those foreigners were Africans, not Europeans. So we don't know exactly what happened to them, but this would have been the first colony on our land, the United States, that actually practiced the belief that all people, whether newcomer from another land or native to the community that we're talking about, were created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that that's something that's worth celebrating on this day of giving thanks and recognizing that there's so much more, because all around the Americas, you find that there is this hidden history of bridges and unity between the indigenous peoples and the enslaved peoples, these maroon societies, these entire towns and cultures, some of which existed for hundreds of years or even exist still today, that showed that it was possible to have people from other lands coming together on this land without it being genocide. And that we can give thanks for the way that they supported us as Black people. And we can also, give thanks as a verb by supporting them today.